Let us now discuss about the core hardware components. Be it any type of computer like a desktop, a laptop, or a smartphone, all these different type of computer need to have these four components present in them. And what are those components? RAM, which is also known as a random access memory, which is used for temporary storage of data. And then we have something known as a storage drive, which is used for the permanent storage of data. And then we have something known as a CPU, which is like the brain of a computer system. And then we have motherboard, which is like the connector of the overall computer system. Let us now discuss about random access memory, which is also known as a volatile memory. And what is it used for? This memory is used to store data. Data about what? The data about frequently accessed program and processes. Now, what do you mean by this program and this process? We know program is basically a set of instruction or line of codes which resides in your storage drive. But whenever you want to execute this program or these sets of instruction, you send it to something called the CPU, where the actual processing of these sets of instruction takes place, and this program in execution inside the CPU is something known as a process. The next point tells us why RAM is called a volatile memory. It's because the data held by it gets erased every time the computer restarts. Now, what do you mean by that? Okay, let us consider a simple scenario. Suppose you have a gaming application. So this is nothing but a set of instruction or line of codes. So you can call this as a program, right? Now you want to play this game. So what do? You double click on the gaming icon, and what you see is that these sets of instruction, right, it gets loaded into something known as the CPU. And when the program gets loaded into a CPU for execution, it's something called as a process. Now suppose you are playing the game. Suppose you are like playing a game, you are like moving from level 1 to level 2, and in the middle of the game there is a power cut, or let's say because of some error in your computer system, your computer suddenly restarts. Now what you see is that what happens is that after the computer gets restarted, you see the data from your game which you were playing before the computer got restarted is not there anymore, and because of which you again have to restart from the same level 1 thing and move on to level 2. And this is the reason why the RAM is called a volatile memory, because the data gets erased every time. Now, the third point says that RAM helps programs and games to start up and close quickly. It's basically a fact, and the reason to this is because suppose, let's consider a scenario. Suppose the CPU wants data, but the data which the CPU is looking for is not present in the RAM. So what happens is that there is a delay, and the delay is because the data need to be brought right from the storage device. From the storage device, the data gets transferred to the RAM, and once the RAM has the data, it says to the CPU that the data which you are looking for is with me, so now you can have the data. That being said, now the fourth point says CPU always access data from RAM. Whenever a CPU needs some data, it asks for the data from the RAM, and that's the reason why RAM is also known as a primary memory. Now, if you are thinking what a RAM looks like in real life, it looks somewhat like this. Now that we know what a RAM actually is, let us talk about storage drives. So, what is a storage drive? Storage drive is also a hardware just like a RAM, and it's used to store data. But unlike RAM, it can store data permanently. Whenever you want to store data permanently, you make use of storage drive. And what kind of data can it store? It can store any kind of data that the computer can understand. So it can be a text file, okay, and then it can be a movie file, or it can be some zip file, and so on and so forth. Every computer needs a storage drive, and modern computers nowadays make use of hard disk drive and solid state drive. A hard disk drive looks similar to this, and a solid state drive looks something like a SIM card with no movable part. These have some movable parts in form of this magnetic disk, but the solid state drive, on the other hand, it doesn't have any movable parts. Beside that, a solid state drive is expensive as compared to a HDD drive, and performance wise also, the performance of solid state drive is much higher as compared to that of a disk drive. Other than HDD and SSD, storage drive also includes USB flash drive, which looks somewhat like this, and then we have CD or DVD, which are circular in shape if you have seen, and then we have something called a floppy disk. If you haven't seen, please go and check it out on the internet. Let us now move forward and discuss something about the CPU, the central processing unit. Well, the first point, as you can see over here, it says that the CPU is the brain of the entire computer system. And that's true because what we have seen earlier in this video is that every processing works is carried out by something which we call it as a CPU. If you are wondering what it's look like, it looks somewhat like this, and it's basically a chip which gets installed inside of a motherboard. Having said that, let's now see the second line. The second line here says whenever we write a program. And what is a program? It's a set of instruction or a line of codes using any programming languages like Python, Java, C++, and then there are programming languages like C, Visual Basics. All these line of codes which we write, it gets broken down into something which is known as an assembly language. Now, this is a language that our processor over here can understand. It means that this processor which we are seeing over here, it only understands an assembly language. Now the third point, it says that all the processes. What is a process? Well, a process is a program which is being executed by the CPU. It's handled by the CPU. Okay, and now let us see how a CPU works. Well, what happens is that it takes raw data from RAM. So suppose we have a RAM over here, and here we have our CPU. So the raw data travels to the CPU for something known as processing of data. And who helps the CPU in turn to process the data? It is something known as a program. And what is a program? A program is lines of codes, which is also known as a set of instruction. And then once the data from RAM reaches the CPU for processing and it gets processed, the processed data is then given out by CPU again to the RAM, and the processed data is known as information. Well, now that we know what is a hardware and that we have seen the different components of hardware, like the input devices, the output devices, and then some core components which is needed in every computer system, such as CPU, a RAM, and a storage drive. Let us now discuss something which is known as a motherboard. So, what is a motherboard? Well, a motherboard is a circuit board which looks somewhat like this. And what is it used for? Well, it connects all components of computer. Now, when we say the components of computer, we are talking about your input devices, and then we have something called the output devices, and your core components like the CPU, your RAM, and your storage drive. All these components, they communicate with one another via something known as a motherboard. Having said that, we can think of motherboard as something as a glue that holds every components of a computer system together so that they are able to communicate with each other.